Welcome to the MarkLogic Security video series from MarkLogic University. This video is the second part in a series of topics covering important concepts to understand when implementing a security model in MarkLogic. In this video, we're going to cover users and roles. In this video, you will learn what users and roles are, and you'll learn how to create users and roles while implementing a sample security model for a project that we'll be working on. To follow along with this tutorial, you'll need to download and install MarkLogic. As we progress throughout this tutorial, we'll refer to various pieces of code, and these examples are available through the MarkLogic University GitHub site should you wish to follow along at home. MarkLogic implements a role-based security model. Users are defined, and in order for a user to do anything in the system, they must have at least one role. A user can also be assigned multiple roles. For example, when we initialized our host back in episode 1 of this series, we created an admin user. This is a user which is given the admin role. A user with the MarkLogic admin role inherits all the other roles in the system, making that user all-powerful. In reality, very few people are MarkLogic admin users. And it's a good idea to implement your security model up front rather than doing all your development work as an administrator and then trying to lock things down later on. One approach would be to lock things down by creating several project-specific roles, such as a role for people with requirements to access core application functionality, as well as a role for people who require elevated functionality, a project admin role, for your example. Not a MarkLogic admin overall, but a project-specific admin or power user. You might also choose to implement roles to help govern the content that a given user has permissions to access within a database. For example, certain roles that allow a person to read certain types of content, but not others. Roles also exhibit inheritance. So you can set up a model with a hierarchy where higher level roles inherit lower level permissions from the roles beneath them. For the example that we are implementing in this tutorial, we're going to have some fun implementing a model based on the classic James Bond spy series. We're going to create 4 roles. The first role is called Project Default. We'll eventually use this role to set up what we call the default user. And this will define what rights someone should have when they visit our application prior to logging in as a known user. We'll also create a role called Project Admin. Users with this role will be granted some power within our application that other users are not given. For example, maybe that means they have the ability to create new content or update existing content within the database. We'll also create a role called Top Secret Read. Users with this role will get read permissions on documents that are classified as top secret. Users with this role will inherit the secret read role. And because the security database is shared, this role could be useful across different projects and databases where these classification schemes are present. And finally, we'll create a role called Secret Read. Users with this role will get read permissions on secret documents, but not top secret documents. And again, this role could be useful across different projects and databases. We'll then create users and assign them to these appropriate roles. So let's go ahead and implement this example. So the first thing that we're going to do is open up a browser and launch the Query Console application. So we can do so at localhost port 8000. And next we're going to log in, and we can use the admin credentials that we created in episode 1. And what we're going to do is import a Query Console workspace that has a few code examples that we're going to use to create the roles and users in the model that we're trying to implement. So to implement a workspace, we'll just select over here and choose Import Workspace. and we'll browse out to wherever you placed the contents of the MarkLogic University GitHub site on your file system. So I happen to put mine on the C drive in a folder called MLU On Demand, and here we see the different episodes. This is all coming from the MarkLogic University GitHub site. And if we go into episode 2, we see security episode 2.xml. This is the workspace that we want. So let's go ahead and choose that and click Import. Now we see some different tabs here that are going to walk us through the creation of these various roles and users. These examples all use server-side JavaScript and the MarkLogic Management REST API in order to create these roles and these users without having to use a user interface such as the admin interface on port 8001. However, please keep in mind that all of these things could also have been done by hand simply by going out to port 8001, which is our admin interface. In here, you could access the security option where you'd have the ability to create users as well as to create roles. But because I want us to think about how are we going to deploy this repeatedly and without leaving us open for potential user error, we're going to do a scripted approach leveraging JavaScript and the MarkLogic Management REST API. So the first thing that we're going to do is create a role that is going to represent that default role. So in order to create the role, we're actually going to be building an HTTP request using a built-in function in MarkLogic, XDMP HTTP post. And we're going to be building this request against an endpoint in the Management REST API that lets us create and configure roles. And we're going to define that role in a variable that contains JSON, and we're going to define that role name. We're then going to build this request and send it to this endpoint. And when we run this, we should then create this role inside of the security database. So let's go ahead and test this out. We'll click Run, and we get a response back here. Notice this is an HTTP response, and it's giving us a 201, which is a success. That's telling us that we were successful in creating this role. Now we can validate this if we were to go out to the admin interface and look at our roles that are defined on the system. We should now be able to see that we have a role called Project Default. Okay, so again, everything that we're doing here via our script, which is using the underlying Management REST API, could also be done by hand. But we're scripting it with the goal of being to have a repeatable deployment process that we can use as we go from environment to environment. All right, so what's up next? Let's create that admin role. Now remember, this is our project admin role, not the MarkLogic admin. So we're going to call this role project admin. And just like we did to create the default role, we're going to build a request to the roles endpoint in the Management REST API. Let's go ahead and run that, and this will create our project admin role. And next up, we need to create our secret role. So here we're going to create this role. We're going to name it Secret Read. And again, we're going to build that request to the roles endpoint in the Management REST API. And let's go ahead and run this to create the secret role. And now let's create the top secret role. Now this configuration is slightly different than the others, and that's because this role exhibits inheritance. So first thing we see is that we define the role name as Top Secret Read, and then we define that it should inherit another role. In this case, the Secret Read role that we just created. So we run this in order to create the top secret role. Now we could go back out to the admin interface just to validate all this. We refresh it. We see that we now have our project admin role along with our project default role. And we also have our top secret read role and our secret read role. And if you look at the top secret read role, you will see that it inherits the secret read role. So now we've created all of the roles that we outlined in our security design. What we now need to do is create those users. So if you recall, we had 3 users: a default user, a user for M, and a user for bond. Let's go ahead and start by creating our default user. And if we look at this configuration, the first thing we see is we're defining a username and a password, and then we're defining which roles this user should be given. To keep things simple, we're just going to define the password as the string pass, P-A-S-S. And this default user, we're going to give the role that we created specifically for them the project default role. Now, to build this request and create this user, we're now going to use an endpoint in the Management REST API called users. So if we run this, we get the success. We've now created a user and associated it with that role. Now let's repeat this for both M and bond. When we look at the definition for the M user, we notice that this user is going to inherit or be assigned 2 roles: the project admin role and the top secret read role. Let's go ahead and run this to see the result. So that creates this user. Let's now check and see what that user looks like. So if we go back to our admin interface and look under users, we now see a user called M, and we can see the roles that are assigned to this user, and we see top secret read, and project admin. And again, this is that concept of role inheritance. We did not explicitly define that the M user should be given the secret read role. However, because the top secret read role inherits the secret read role, this user is also assigned that role. Next, let's go out and create our bond user. And bond, if you recall, should be given the secret read role. And again, we'll build this request to the Management REST API, specifically the user's endpoint, to go ahead and create this bond user. And there we go. Just to validate everything, let's go back to the admin interface and take a look at all of the defined users in our environment. And we see that we have a user for bond, a user for M, and we also have our project default user. Let's review some of the key takeaways from our discussion on users and roles. First off, we've seen that users are assigned roles, and a user must have at least one role in order to do anything in the system. Roles define what that user can do. For example, can that user read documents, or change documents, or create new documents? These are what we call permissions, and we'll talk about permissions more detailed in the next episode. Roles also define what privileges a user has. For example, can a user execute a particular function? We'll talk more about privileges in a future episode as well. We've seen that roles can exhibit inheritance and therefore inherit other roles. And we know from our discussions back in episode 1 that users and roles are documents that get stored in the security database. So in summary, we've taken a closer look at users and roles, and we've looked at how to create those users and roles by leveraging the Management REST API and server-side JavaScript. As a next step, make sure to go out and download MarkLogic from developer.marklogic.com. You can then follow along with the examples in this episode by accessing the code samples at the MarkLogic University GitHub site. If you need more training, visit marklogic.com/training to view all of our different training options. And if you wish to watch some more on-demand tutorials like this one, please revisit our on-demand website or download the MLU mobile app. And finally, don't forget to show off your new skills. Add MarkLogic as a skill to your LinkedIn profile today. Thank you for watching this MarkLogic University on-demand tutorial.